The sound of zip ties ratcheting tight against human skin is a noise that never really leaves your head. A sharp, plastic zip that signals the end of freedom and the beginning of a nightmare. And there I was, standing in the driveway of the home I had literally broken my back to buy, watching a deputy sheriff manhandle my wife, Elena, pushing her against the hood of our truck like she was a dangerous felon instead of a 48-year-old forensic accountant who enjoys knitting on Sundays. I felt paralyzed, stuck in that thick, suffocating sludge of confusion and rage, unable to process the image of my wife's terrified eyes locking onto mine while a woman named Patricia, a neighborhood tyrant with hair sprayed into a helmet of blonde defiance, stood 10 feet away filming the entire humiliation on her iPhone with a smile that can only be described as predatory. She wasn't just watching, she was feasting on our misery, waving a laminated violation notice from the Timber Creek Community Preservation Society like it was a royal decree, while our actual property deed, the legal proof that we owned every inch of this dirt, fluttered across the gravel in the wind, ignored by the very law enforcement officers sworn to protect it. But let's rewind, because to understand how we ended up with Elena in the back of a squad car over a gate color, you have to understand the dream we were trying to build. I'm Lucas, a guy who has spent 3 decades crawling through crawl spaces and wiring breaker boxes, saving every dime so that one day, the ringing in my ears wouldn't be construction saws, but the sound of wind through the pines. We found it 2 hours north of the city, a vintage cabin on the edge of Timber Creek Lake, a place that smelled like rain and cedar, the kind of spot where your blood pressure drops 10 points just by parking the car. The realtor, a woman who smiled too much, mentioned that the neighbors were spirited, a euphemism I now realize is real estate code for clinically insane. But we were too blinded by the view of the water to care. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 14 days. I was out back, stacking cords of oak for the winter, enjoying the rhythm of physical labor on my own land, when a voice cut through the silence like a rusty bandsaw. "Excuse me, are you the current occupant?" I turned to see a woman standing at the edge of my lot, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it contained the nuclear launch codes, wearing a polo shirt embroidered with a fake crest and a measuring tape draped around her neck like a stethoscope. She introduced herself as Patricia Vance, the president of the Timber Creek Community Preservation Society, and before I could even offer her a glass of water, she launched into a monologue that would make a drill sergeant blush. "Your gate is the wrong shade of rustic umber," she declared, her eyes scanning my property with the cold calculation of a Terminator. "Your boat dock exceeds the visual setback variance by 6 inches. Your firewood stack is creating an aesthetic disruption, and that mailbox? It's aggressively non-compliant." She slapped a citation on my porch railing, $350 in immediate fines, plus a $75 monthly association fee, retroactive to our closing date. When Elena came out, wiping dishwater from her hands and looking confused, Patricia's demeanor shifted from bureaucratic to condescendingly sweet. "Oh, honey," she purred. "I know you city people think rules are suggestions, but here at Timber Creek, we protect our property values with vigor." The way she said city people sounded like a slur. 2 days later, she returned, but this time she brought muscle. Her son, Brandon, a 30-something guy who looked like he'd never lifted anything heavier than a vape pen, yet he was wearing a tactical vest and a badge that said compliance officer. Brandon proceeded to photograph our property from every invasive angle imaginable, snapping pictures of our windows, our truck, and even the way we parked, while Patricia shoved a final notice under our windshield wiper, a document that threatened legal escalation if we didn't repaint our gate by the weekend. Here's the kicker. I've been a contractor for 30 years, and I know the smell of a hustle when it hits me. That night, I took a walk down the gravel road and noticed that 6 other cabins had the same white notices fluttering on their gates, marking them like plagued houses. Elena, whose brain works like a supercomputer when she smells financial rot, opened her laptop and started digging. "Lucas," she said, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, "there is no Timber Creek Community Preservation Society registered with the state." She pulled up the county clerk's records, her fingers flying across the keys. She filed for an LLC 3 years ago, but let it lapse. She never registered as an HOA, never filed bylaws, never established a board. This woman is running a phantom government. The realization hit us like a cold wave. We weren't fighting a bureaucracy, we were fighting a grifter. Elena, being the kind of woman who brings a bazooka to a knife fight, went to the hardware store the next morning and bought a military-grade electronic lock for our gate, the kind that requires a passcode and a fingerprint. And then she posted private property signs every 50 feet, laminated and legally binding. She started a logbook, documenting every interaction with the precision of a forensic accountant building a RICO case, noting times, dates, and verbatim quotes. Patricia didn't take the hint. 3 days later, I was inside replacing a ceiling fan when I heard Elena shouting. I looked out the window to see Patricia standing there with bolt cutters, actual, heavy-duty bolt cutters, trying to snap our new lock, while Brandon filmed her, narrating like he was hosting a reality show about suburban justice. This gate blocks emergency easements. Patricia screamed at Elena, who was calmly recording the entire thing on her phone. The association has the right to remove obstructions. Show me the easement deed. Elena shouted back, standing her ground. That's when the deputies arrived. Deputy Miller, a man who looked like he was one bad day away from early retirement, stepped out of his cruiser, and Patricia immediately switched into victim mode, spinning a tale about us being squatters who were endangering the community by blocking fire lanes. She produced a binder of documents, bylaws, covenants, maps, that looked official if you didn't look too closely, but were clearly drafted in Microsoft Word by someone with a delusion of grandeur. Elena tried to show Deputy Miller our deed, the survey, the title insurance, but Patricia was louder, more confident, throwing around terms like covenant enforcement and statutory compliance. And in that moment of chaos, I watched the system fail. Deputy Miller, seemingly overwhelmed, and perhaps knowing Patricia from previous encounters, decided the easiest way to de-escalate was to remove the aggressor. "Ma'am, you're creating a disturbance," he told Elena. "I'm on my own property," she argued. And then came the handcuffs. The click that haunts me. Patricia smirked, Brandon zoomed in, and I stood there, helpless, watching my wife get detained on our own land because a con artist had a louder voice than the truth. But what Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have realized as she stood there gloating, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She hadn't just annoyed a neighbor. She had declared war on a woman who could trace a single dollar through a labyrinth of shell companies. And Elena wasn't going to just get mad. She was going to get even. The charges against Elena were dropped before the ink was even dry on the police report, mainly because Elena spent the ride to the station educating Deputy Miller on property law until he realized he'd made a catastrophic error, but the damage was done. We weren't just neighbors having a spat anymore. We were in the trenches. The harassment campaign that followed was something straight out of a psychological thriller. Patricia, realizing that direct confrontation hadn't broken us, decided to starve us out. Monday morning, the lights went out. Not a blown fuse, but a hard cut. We called the power company and were told that a concerned resident had reported an unauthorized, hazardous hookup at our address. Tuesday, the water pressure died because someone called the county claiming our well was contaminating the groundwater. Wednesday, the health department showed up with clipboards because of an anonymous tip that our septic tank was leaking raw sewage into the lake. It was a siege. We were bleeding money on inspections and reconnection fees, losing sleep and questioning our sanity. Elena, however, was in her element. She turned our dining table into a war room, covering it with spreadsheets, county maps, and financial records. She dug into the history of the lake and discovered a graveyard of dreams. The Hendersons, a young couple, had sold at a loss last year just to escape. The Gables, a retired couple in their 70s, were paying Patricia $50 a month in compliance fees, just so she wouldn't report their wheelchair ramp as a code violation. It was extortion, plain and simple. A protection racket disguised as neighborhood watch. One afternoon, I ran into Gary, Patricia's boyfriend, at the local supply store. Gary was a soft man, the kind who echoed whatever the strongest person in the room said. But that day, he tried to play the heavy. He cornered me in the paint aisle, smelling like stale cigarettes and arrogance. "You know, Lucas," he said, picking at a fingernail, "accidents happen around the lake. Docks collapse. Boats sink. It'd be a shame if you guys kept rocking the boat." I looked him dead in the eye. "Is that a threat, Gary?" He smirked. Just an observation on the fragility of property. The store owner, Mr. Henderson, was listening from behind the counter, pretending to count screws. I made sure to speak loudly. Your girlfriend is running a scam, Gary, and we have the documentation to prove it. Gary's face fell, but the threats turned into action. Patricia started holding emergency community meetings in her driveway, whipping the other fearful neighbors into a frenzy, claiming Elena and I were bringing criminal elements to the lake. But Elena had found the smoking gun. In her deep dive of public records, she discovered that Patricia hadn't paid property taxes in 4 years and, ironically, her own septic system had been cited for critical failure 18 months ago. She was projecting her own crimes onto everyone else. We decided to build an army. We invited the Gables and a few other terrified neighbors over for a barbecue. It took convincing, but the smell of grilled burgers and the promise of solidarity brought them out of the shadows. Mrs. Gable, her hands shaking, confessed she'd paid nearly $2,000 over the years to keep Patricia away. Another neighbor, Mr. Sterling, a man with a heart condition, admitted Patricia's harassment had sent him to the ER twice. We were building trust, bonding over the shared trauma, when Patricia, Brandon, and Gary appeared at the edge of the firelight like wraiths. This gathering violates the noise ordinance. Patricia shrieked, waving a decibel meter app on her phone. Brandon, document this hostility. Elena calmly walked to the edge of the property. Get off my land, Patricia, or I call the state police and show them the tax fraud records I pulled this morning. Patricia turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, before she retreated into the darkness. We thought we had won the battle, but the war was about to turn scorching hot. At 2 a.m. that night, Elena shook me awake. Smoke, she whispered. I bolted up, the smell of burning pine and gasoline hitting my nostrils, a scent that triggers a primal panic in anyone who lives in the woods. I looked out the window and saw orange flames licking up the brush line, just 30 yards from our cabin, racing toward the propane tank. We scrambled. Elena on the phone with 911, me running out with a garden hose that felt pathetically inadequate against the growing inferno. The fire was moving unnaturally fast, fueled by something chemical. The volunteer fire department arrived in 10 minutes, miraculously fast, and managed to drown the flames before they reached the house. But the fire marshal didn't mince words. This wasn't lightning, he said, pointing his flashlight at a scorched patch of earth. Smell that? That's accelerant. Someone poured gas here. Our security cameras, the ones Elena had installed the week before, captured a grainy figure sprinting away from the scene just minutes before the smoke appeared. The figure had the distinct, lumbering gait of Brandon. The attempt on our lives, and that's what it was, shattered the last remnants of fear in the community. Mr. Henderson from the hardware store came forward and gave a statement to the police. Brandon had bought a 5-gallon gas can that very afternoon, acting nervous. Elena looked at the charred ground the next morning, her face hard as stone. They tried to burn us out, Lucas. Now, I'm going to burn their world down. Legally. She hatched a plan that was pure genius. We needed undeniable proof, not just of the arson, but of the financial fraud, the extortion, the whole racket. Elena set up a sting. She forged emails between us, printed them out, and accidentally left them in a recycling bin we knew Patricia raided for intel. The emails discussed us being broke, terrified, and ready to pay whatever settlement the association demanded just to make it stop. Patricia took the bait. She showed up 2 days later, smug and triumphant, carrying a settlement agreement she had typed up. I'm a reasonable woman, Patricia said, sitting on our porch, unaware that 3 different high-fidelity microphones were recording her, and that Elena had a live stream feed running to a private server. If you pay the $5,000 nuisance fee in cash and sign this NDA, all the violations go away. The gate, the dock, everything. Wait, I said, playing the defeated husband. So the violations, they aren't real? You can just make them vanish. Patricia laughed, a sound like grinding gears. Oh, Lucas, the rules are whatever I say they are. That's how we keep the riffraff out. I've been doing this for years. The county doesn't care, the police don't understand, and people pay. It's the price of admission. She admitted it. All of it. The fake rules, the arbitrary enforcement, the cash payments. She confessed to a felony on tape. But Elena wasn't satisfied with just a recording. She wanted a public execution of Patricia's character. She had discovered that the county commissioners were holding a town hall meeting the following Tuesday, and she had quietly secured a slot on the agenda. We weren't just going to the police, we were going to the court of public opinion. The atmosphere in the county meeting hall was heavy, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and nervous sweat. It was standing room only, mostly because Elena had spent the last 48 hours mobilizing every victim, every witness, and every disgruntled neighbor within a 20-mile radius. We sat in the front row, a stack of evidence binders rising like a fortress on the table before us. Patricia arrived late, flanked by Brandon and Gary, strutting down the center aisle like she was accepting an award, completely oblivious to the trap that had been set. She even waved at Commissioner Reynolds, unaware that Reynolds had already reviewed Elena's preliminary brief and was currently staring at Patricia with the expression one reserves for a particularly nasty cockroach. When Commissioner Reynolds called our names, Elena stood up. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a prosecutor. She connected her laptop to the projector, and the screen behind her lit up. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Elena began, her voice steady and echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We are here to discuss the Timber Creek Community Preservation Society, an entity that exists solely in the imagination of one woman, and in the bank account where she deposits the stolen money of senior citizens." Slide 1. The Secretary of State records showing no such HOA existed. Slide 2. A graph comparing the dues collected versus the $0 spent on community maintenance. Slide 3. The bank records Elena had subpoenaed through a lawyer friend, showing transfers from the HOA fund to pay for Patricia's car lease, Brandon's legal fees for a previous DUI, and vacations to Cabo. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the projector fan. Patricia stood up, her face flushing a deep, violent purple. "This is slander. These are fabricated documents. I am a pillar of this community." And finally, Elena cut in, her voice slicing through Patricia's screeching. "I present Exhibit D." She hit play. The audio from our porch blasted through the PA system. Patricia's voice, unmistakable and arrogant. "The rules are whatever I say they are. It's the price of admission." The gasp from the crowd was audible. Then, the murmuring started, growing into a roar. Patricia looked around, realizing the walls were closing in. She tried to storm the podium, pointing a trembling finger at Elena. "You recorded me without consent. That's illegal. I am the law in Timber Creek." "Actually, ma'am," Commissioner Reynolds interrupted, banging his gavel. "You are under investigation." The doors at the back of the hall opened, and 2 state troopers walked in, followed by Detective Vance, no relation, holding a warrant. The color drained from Patricia's face so fast, she looked like a ghost. They didn't just come for the fraud. They came for the arson. Brandon saw the troopers and tried to slip out a side door, but Mr. Henderson from the hardware store physically blocked his path, crossing his arms with a satisfied grin. The arrest was chaotic and loud. Patricia screaming about her rights, claiming she knew the governor, while Brandon immediately started crying and blaming his mother for making him buy the gas. It was captured by the local Channel 4 news crew, a clip that would go viral by morning. 6 months later, the sentencing hearing was the closure we desperately needed. Patricia, stripped of her fake authority and her hairspray, pleaded guilty to 17 counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit arson. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for bullying, sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, followed by mandatory restitution to every single neighbor she had swindled. Brandon got 18 months in probation for turning state's evidence against his mother. Gary? He vanished into the wind, likely finding another scam to leech onto in a different state. But the real victory wasn't the prison sentences, it was what happened to Timber Creek. With the tyrant gone, the fear evaporated. We formed a real community committee, not an HOA, but a volunteer group. I started a Lake Life DIY YouTube channel to teach neighbors how to fix the things Patricia used to find them for. Mrs. Gable hosts coffee mornings on her dock, no longer afraid of losing her home. The air at the lake feels different now, lighter, freer. Elena became a local hero. She used the settlement money to start a legal defense fund for victims of HOA fraud, traveling the state to teach people how to audit their own associations. We turned the site of the fire, that scorched patch of earth near our cabin, into a community garden. Where there was once hate and gasoline, we now grow tomatoes and wildflowers. Yet, as I sit here on my dock, watching the sun dip below the pine line, I can't help but think about the shadows that linger. Patricia's cabin sits empty, a rotting monument to greed, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I still hear the phantom click of those zip ties. It reminds me that justice isn't a guarantee. It's something you have to fight for, tooth and nail, against people who believe they are above the rules. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many Patricius are out there right now, wearing polo shirts and wielding clipboards, terrorizing families who don't know how to fight back? At what point does maintaining standards cross the line into destroying lives? And if we hadn't had the money, the skills, and the sheer stubbornness to fight, would we have ended up just another family fleeing paradise at a loss? Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they were God? Did you fight back, or did you move? Hit that subscribe button, because next week, I'm telling the story of how Mr. Henderson and I had to physically stop a contractor from stealing a driveway. You can't make this stuff up. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong in your own home.